morning again to everyone that joined us recently. As we're waiting for the rest of the guys to join us, feel free to add your questions in the chat. We will have a question session after each presenter. You will work through your questions and hope to answer it. And you are welcome to gently interrupt the presenter as well. Please keep your discussions short. If it's a lengthy discussion, we might not make it in time. But I hope everyone enjoys it.
Okay, Carol, I see it's almost 4:00. We can start.
Thank you, Matlacho. I presume you're controlling Zoom, am I correct?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Morning, everybody. This is the continuation of the Energy Performance, or as we know it, EPC series. And today the topic is EPC and building plans specifically, not another topics, so EPC and building plans. My name is Carl Steyn. I am one of the SAWEC, South African Energy Efficiency Confederation Executive Board members, and I'll be your host for today. Thank you for your participation and making the time to attend this webinar. I'm sure that's a topical issue and everybody wants to know more. And I think that's why you're all online. We have three very informative and knowledgeable presenters this morning. I will introduce each of them just before they present. Can I request that you note your questions in the webinar chat online, as Tida has mentioned earlier, and we will deal with these after the presentation. I think that's easier just to make sure that we stick to the time limits that we have. Also be aware that some of your questions might be related to future webinars. And in future webinars, some of those questions might be covered. Let me just share the screen to show you the future webinars so that you're aware what's coming your ways and which questions can be asked or which can't be asked. Matlacho, can you see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Today we're covering EPC and building plans. Next is 9 September is controlling conflict of interest in EPC process. Then we cover how to quote for EPC work. In October, we'll have safety aspects in EPCs, measurement equipment in 21st October. In November, we have what it means to be a SANA's EPC inspection body, and the cost involved is there. Then also we've got EPC training dates, which is the cost involved there, and that's what you can expect. So be aware that questions related to topics in future, we will not deal with those today. Okay. That was it from my side. Let me continue then. Is everybody happy with the arrangement on the questions? Thank you. I don't get any response, so I presume it's you're happy. May I also then ask that you ensure your microphones are all on mute except the presenter and your video streaming off. That enables others that might have connection problems to make it easier for them. Well, of course, you're more than willing to switch them on when you pose a question or present or want to mention something. Matlacho, can I confirm that the webinar recording will be shared later?
Yes, the recording will be available to the SAEC members only, unfortunately.
Okay, sure. Thank you very much for that. Everybody else happy that it's been recorded?
Yep.
Thank you very much. Okay, then without further ado, allow me to introduce the first speaker. Let me just get the document. The first one is Jerry Rubert. Jerry has moved into academia, has 30 years of experience in architectural education. He was also involved with the National Department of Public Works as the chief architect. Well, Public Works as the chief architect, sorry for that. Jerry served on the SIBS committee to draft the SANS 1544 energy performance certificates for buildings and accompanied the delegation to Germany to study this experience. He is currently part of the working group with SIBS, the working group covering SANS 10400XA, and also serves on that SANS 3088, which drafted the water efficiency in buildings standard. He is an author and authored and co-authored several academic papers for the International Passive and Low Architecture conferences. With that, Jerry, over to you. Please, let's hear what you've got to say today.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the introduction. And yeah, I must probably thank Tida for twisting my arm, or that you should thank Tida for twisting my arm to actually take part in this. But yeah, welcome to everybody. And I hope that I can contribute something to this discussion. Right, so let me kick off with sharing my screen. Now, I have two screens and I always get confused as to which one I must be sharing. So just bear with me.
Jerry, we can see your screen.
Okay, let me just launch.
Thank you.
Is that,
that's 100%.
can you?
100%, thank you.
Okay, good. All right, so the questions that, there were a few questions, I'll come to them now. So it's really just a discussion on drawings and the determination of net floor area. And the main topics that I was requested to address was how to read and understand a building plan. And then if a plan is not available, what is allowed an alternative? And how to take measurements of a building to verify its size. And then lastly, what constitutes an acceptable form of a plan for EPC requirements. And I think the first point to make is that both SANS 1544 and the regulations that were promulgated by the minister are silent on all of these points. Plans and issues of that nature are not mentioned at all. It's really just about determining the net floor area. So I want to just go back to some of the definitions, and you'll probably see why. In the national building regulations, there is a definition of what a building is, I think, and it differs slightly from what is in 10400, etc. So it's important to understand building and plan. So a building in this context that comes from SANS 1544 is a roof construction with walls for which energy is used to condition the indoor climate and to provide domestic hot water and illumination and other services related to the use of the building. So that kind of defines it quite clearly as what a building is. In terms of the national building regulations, this is a matter of interest. Why I mention this is because swimming pools and all sorts of things like that are actually classified as buildings, and that relates more to the submission of documentation to local authorities. Okay, so this puts it in perspective. And then a plan. Well, a plan is normally a horizontal section taken at approximately 1200 or 1.2. And we are really only interested in the plan area at floor level. So I dug out the sketch. Some of you might know, world famous architect Zaha Hadid. She's now unfortunately passed on. Designs all kinds of rather unique looking buildings. And where we have sloping walls, etc., we would only be interested in the net floor area, so at the floor. And just as a matter of interest, because I'm an architect, I have to have pictures. these are a couple of her creations. And it is actually relevant in the sense is that if it's a complex building, I think you're going to need certainly a higher level of expertise to determine the net floor area as opposed to a relatively conventional building. Okay, so to get on to from SANS 1544, the net floor area is defined as the sum of all areas between vertical building components, walls and partitions, excluding garages, car parks and storerooms. And that's it in a nutshell. And then 5.4 is right at the end of the standard, also refers to energy consumed by things like garages, car parks and storage areas, as well as energy consumed by outdoor services, for example, landscape, lighting, security, etc., shall be excluded through measurements or assessments from the energy performance. Okay, so that covers the 3.11 really is, I think, very important in that we have a clear understanding of what's to be excluded, and it is only the vertical elements. Building components or walls or partitions. So all the stairways, if they are included in the conditioned envelope, lift shafts, toilets, the works are all included as net floor area. And I want to stress this point because it is people from different, different sort of interest in buildings, from SAPOA to estate agents, etc., all have a kind of what's usable space. And this doesn't refer to usable space. It just says you must take out the solid elements, which are columns and walls. Okay, good. I want to start with point number 2 first, because point number 1 is the most difficult to answer. So let's do the easy stuff first. So if a plan is not available, what's allowed as an alternative? Well, my first comment there, I think, is you must take really great effort to try and locate plans. Try the architects, try engineers that were involved, others, check the local authority records, archives, check with the insurers and facility managers, etc. Because if you don't have a plan, there is only one real alternative, and it's rather more work. So a plan is not necessary to determine the floor area, but very useful. And considering if one looks at general buildings, there is a kind of a logic about them. But if you looked at some of those that I showed you there, a floor area or a floor plan would be really useful to have. So if it's not available, then measurement on site would be necessary. But this is the most tedious and expensive method available. And I mean, I've got little illustrations there, everything from a little laser thing to LiDAR to a tape measure. My recommendation as an architect, and I've measured up several buildings, is to go and look on site, draw a basic layout of the building, and then go and actually start measuring. And I'll come back to sort of accuracy in a minute. The next question was how to take measurements of a building to verify its size. Well, there are two options here. If drawings are available, then probably ask, and I put there rather cheekily, and pay the architectural professionals or the authors of it to measure the floor area in the native format, such as ArchiCAD, AutoCAD, or Revit, or CADI, one of the drafting programs, because it's really quite an easy task, and it's not a very difficult task. You know, one goes with a mouse and clicks on the various parts, and you can eliminate all the walls and columns, and you can fairly quickly get to the net floor area. And one of the important things there, in speaking to friends of mine relating to this particular thing, is where you've got, you know, circular shapes and you've got triangles in the building. The architects and the professionals really understand the geometry and the structure well, and it's not a difficult task. Okay, if you get drawings and you have them in PDF, so if drawings are available in portable document format, Then there are a number of programs that are add-ons, such as this one that I quote you, Blue Beam Review, which you can then put on top of the PDF, and you can use it to determine the floor area, also measurements quite easily. Obviously, one can look at the figured dimensions and add them all up and calculate them. Okay, now on that, how to take measurements, so I've put a comment there as whilst there is maybe a perception that our builders are not that accurate. And I know anybody who's built a house or built onto a house will say, yeah, but the builder didn't get this right and so on. But commercial institution buildings are normally erected with specifications such as that SANS 10155, which is accuracy in buildings. And accuracies are tied down. And there's also the 2001 series, CC1 and CM1 cover concrete work and brickwork. And this implies that there are acceptable tolerances allowed. And from an EC perspective, the level of accuracy is more than sufficient. Now, I remember going to a SANAS meeting, and there were some attendees that were not from an architectural building background. And one of the first questions they asked, because they come from an M&V background, which is much more kind of accurate and so on, were asking about, is it necessary to have tape measuring instruments calibrated? And the answer to that is, I think, really not at all. Any normal tape measure or distance measure is going to be more than accurate. And the reason for that is that if you really take a building, any room, and you measure at the bottom, and you measure midway up the wall, and at the top, you're probably going to get differences. You might be typically, I mean, a really, really well-built wall would be 12 millimeters out. I mean, I worked on a job once where one of the columns was 50 millimeters out, but that's kind of an exception. Now, generally, commercial institutional buildings, there's a structure, there's steel schedules that are produced by the engineers. There's a quantity surveyor who is going to pay on quantities. They're not going to be meters out. There are building lines, there's surveyors. So generally speaking, the drawings, and we'll see what drawings, they are reasonably okay. Right, then if drawings, the next question was, sorry, let me just close that. The next question was how to take measurements to vary of a building to verify its size. Well, again, if drawings are not available, then a lot depends on the complexity of the building. On a fairly rectilinear form, one could take overall dimensions and then deduct the exterior walls, and it would be fairly, obvious what they are generally. Vertical elements such as walls, structure, and other areas that excluded areas as a quick check. So, I mean, to verify that, if you had, like, for argument's sake, a school, you could take an overall dimension and look at the end walls and the width, and then do a quick calculation just to see if the drawings are reasonably accurate. Now, on more complex geometries, like one of the two that I showed you there, one may have to resort to more sophisticated survey techniques, such as LiDAR, which is where you put up an instrument and takes photographs with a laser that very, very quickly gives you very, very accurate drawings. And it's probably cheaper and easier than physical on-site measurement. Again, if it's a complex building, it might be worthwhile to pay an expert to just quickly do that. A trained surveyor would do that relatively easily. Okay, buildings that are fairly modular frame structures, typically concrete structures, are easy to perform a gross check and verify measurements. Okay, then the next question that was posed is what constitutes an acceptable form of a plan for EPC requirements? And the first comment there, I think, is the optimum plan would be from as-built drawings. Now, it is fairly common for clients to receive drawings that are updated to reflect the actual on-site construction, which would update all changes and contract instructions issued. And contract instructions were formerly known as VOs, and that's still a common term. That's why I put it in, because a lot of people talk about VOs, where inevitably in buildings, as the thing progresses, clients often change their minds and move things a little bit, or there's an instruction to the builder to change things slightly. So the as-built drawings would generally capture all of those little changes. But technical or construction drawings, which we normally call working drawings, are preferable to design type drawings or sketch plans, and because they're figured and they're accurate and so on. A third point is drawings submitted to a local authority probably would be sufficient for the purposes of determining the information required. Again, there's generally not vast differences. They are relatively small, and we'll come back to that. Okay. So I just want to reiterate there that SANS 1544 makes no reference to plans, but the determination. So whatever you do, you've got to get the net floor area. I think just on this point of what's an acceptable form of plan, yeah, I think obviously if you're measuring from drawings, I would suggest nobody ever tries to scale off a drawing, but certainly the figure dimensions are there. It's not a really very complex job. It just is a bit time consuming. Okay, then this brings us to the first question, which is how to read and understand a building plan. And as I said, this is probably the most difficult to address. Buildings are a manifestation of a design and thinking process. And the drawings use an array of graphic presentations. Architects use lines and line weights, so thinner lines and thicker lines mean different things, expressing elements such as brickwork, concrete, steel, glass, and a multitude of other elements, whether we show them in outline or whether we show them in section, etc. Physical elements are often shown in cross section, so a column is cut through, but it's not shown as a little black square. It's shown by its outlines, generally speaking. Now, there are obviously drafters of drawings use various cross hatching, so you need to know what they are to try and help interpret it. And they are used to indicate materials and depend on the scale of the drawing. So again, a 1 in 100 scale drawing is going to have a lot less cross hatching than a larger scale drawing of a detail, so 1 in 20, 1 in 10, etc., where we tend to then identify materials. But likely in the EPC context, you will only be working with 1 in 100 plans, not anything else. So it's kind of, a bit irrelevant maybe. Contemporary technology allows the use of color for various elements according to the National Building Regulations. And that's quite an important thing, is that we have certain colors that are used for certain materials and the way they're expressed. And it is determined by the National Building Regulations. Now, yeah, nobody uses blueprints as they were traditionally known. So, I mean, I come from an era where we used to draw on transparent paper, like tracing paper, and then you'd go and put it through a machine and you get blueprints. Nowadays, large-scale plotting is used, that there are no real copies. Every building, every drawing issued to a contractor is kind of an original in the sense that it gets plotted out and just given to him. Right, and there are conventions, and even there is a SANS standard. It's 10143 or 0143. If you look it up, you'll see it's 0143, but the 1 has been added because codes of practice have now become the 100s. Okay, and it's called building drawing practice, but officers often use their own style, a little bit of drafting and so on. So whilst this convention is used to some degree, it's not perfect in the profession. And I've just included a couple of examples here, and one can see fairly clearly on this that this is an original plot. It's got color used, it's got hatching for the brickwork, and the columns are drawn in, which is typically shown concrete, is always colored in green. And yeah, one can see how the dimensions are taken. This one's got a whole different bunch of lines of dimensions. One's got to look carefully if you're measuring and just see that you are including really just the internals. And as I say, for a professional to run his mouse over it and just click on the various areas is not too difficult a process. I mean, it'll take a few hours to do, but it'll give a very accurate bit of information. And then I have another drawing, which is again slightly different technique and different color, but it gives an idea of what we look at every day of our lives. And I think that's kind of, no, it's not quite my last slide. There's one more. Oh yes, how to read continued. In terms of SANS requirements, the requirement for SANS 1544, there are a great number of other issues that a provider of EPCs has to deal with. And I think that's a very important point, that we should, you know, allow people that are knowledgeable with their particular elements to contribute within this chain. It may be expeditious for anyone contemplating becoming an accessor or issuer of EPCs to employ on a contract by a suitably qualified architectural professional, anything from one of the different categories, from a basically a draftsperson up to a technologist to an architect, to determine the net floor area of projects that are being considered. But on that point, I want to just throw into the mix, although it's not strictly related to this topic, but one must remember that what the thrust is of actually getting EPCs. And if one looks at SANS 1544, and you look at the range, so if you're a D building, then you have to be within 10% of what is currently still table 3 of XA, which gives you, for a classification of a building type like A3, which is a school and places of instruction. It gives you, for Pretoria, I wrote it out this morning, it's 400 kilowatt hours per square meter per annum. And if you have your 10 square meters over, you easily still going to fall within the 10% range. So the center of the class has got a 10% leeway before you get to the next class, and the class is getting better. Worse are 0.3 of that value. So in other words, 0.7 whatever, etc., going up to less than a third to give you an A-rated building. The other thing to remember is that if you issue an EPC now, there is a variation in weather patterns, and one can probably find that in 5 years' time, when it's going to be reissued, one would find that it's going to be slightly different, because it's going to depend a lot on whether it was a particularly hot summer or a particularly cold winter, etc., how much energy actually was consumed by the building. So my sort of thoughts of this is, I would, if I find that when I've assessed a building, I'm very close to moving into a better or a worse category, I would then take particular note of my accuracy levels. In other words, what I'm saying here is that I have measured up a building, and it's going to be, from according to my measurements, it's right on the border of, say, a B-rated building, but it could be a C-rated building. That maybe is going to open up a potential hazard for me going on, that if I tell a client that his building is, let's say, A-rated, and subsequently turns out to be that it's actually a B-rated building because it just misses the bottom of that class into the next class, that I think is a problematic area. So if one is relatively comfortable within a class, I think the entire sort of level of accuracy is put into perspective, so that if you're 10 square meters out or 20 square meters out, which is a good bit, with a school of, say, 1,000 square meters, you're easily going to still fall within the class with a slight variation in that. Now, I'm not one to propagate inaccuracies, but I think one's got to have a look at a fairly pragmatic view of what the intention of the standard is, and that is to get a baseline for energy use. And I will end off with that slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. Jerry, one question posed thus far, and you're welcome to add more questions. The question posed, and I'm going to change it slightly, in terms of percentage, being at 5 or 10%, what is deemed acceptable tolerance of measurements between plans of as-built and actual on-site of a building? What do you think, according to the standard?
No, sorry, the sound, suddenly my sound is rather poor. Could you can I just hear that again?
In terms of the standard and percentages, what is deemed acceptable tolerances of measurements between plan of as-built and actual on-site of a building? What do you think would be an acceptable tolerance?
Well, I think if I go back to the document that I put up there, the acceptable tolerances would be rather related to the specification that the builder was asked to deliver. In other words, typically within the framework of those standards in the specification document. But I mean, I would think that in general sort of architectural practice, 20 millimeters out of a wall is quite acceptable. We never build, and deviations in plasterwork and floor levels are within maybe 5 or 6 millimeters over a 2 meter length type of thing. But I mean, that's not going to affect, if you have a 20 millimeters out on the building size, you know, that's going to be more or less the order of it. So the as-built drawing should be the accurate dimensions if there's been a change, but the tolerances are as are in those standards. And I think that, again, one must understand that in the big picture of things, a contractor is going to price on the level of difficulty of the work. So if it's a very tight tolerances that are specified, which some, you know, top-end commercial accommodation does have, then the price will be higher, and he's going to look at the specification document. So I think in general, we would be looking at, 10, 20 millimeters. 20 millimeters is a good tolerance. So if what I'm saying there is that if a building is bigger by 20 millimeters or so, that's quite accurate. If it starts moving over like 50, 60, 70, 80, I think that's where we might have to, you know, that's a bit problematic. I hope that answers the question. I'm not sure that it does, though.
Thank you, Jerry. Christo posed a question and he's got his hand up. Christo, do you want to add or question something on that?
Thank you, Carl. Thank you, Gerry. Let me call you by the correct Afrikaans name, Gerry, not Gary. Thanks for the information and everything. Let me just get my hands down here. Yeah, the main question came back to, lower hand, does it? Thanks. The main question came back as you also stated in the beginning, we were part of that group you said way early, and we were the guys asking questions on accuracies and tolerances and so forth. And where is defined for a meter to be so tolerant and for your shoes to be that tolerant? And we would just like to get an idea, if a plan says on an as-built 10 square meters, and you go to site to just verify and you come to 11 square meters, is that acceptable in your world? Or does it actually mean that we need to say, listen, these plans are not up to spec, they need to be redrawn or adjusted or whatever? Where would you draw the line where the plans are true enough to reality? That's my one question. Then I've got another one. If you'd like to comment on the first one, please.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, I think the figures that you mentioned there, if a room is supposed to be 10 square meters and it's 11, that's a great deal out. And I think that would be an unlikely scenario in a normal commercial project, because the quantity surveyor, if there's generally on these sorts of buildings, there would be quantity surveyors is going to have measured a certain amount of material, and he's going to want to pay out on only 10 square meters, and he's not going to allow the contractor 11 square meters. So the contractor in his own interest is going to keep it fairly accurate, and there will be checks by professionals on that. I think a 1 square meter is a lot out. If it was 10.1 or so, I'd say probably acceptable for the purposes of an EPC. Now, just in the building process, and I keep on having to come back to that, if I have a commercial building, there's a guy who measures windows, and he's going to go on site and measure windows because he knows that he's priced on a window that's X number of meters long. And when he goes on site and he measures and he finds that it's a whole lot out, you can be sure at the next site meeting, he's going to have a big issue, because he's going to say, well, I want more money, and then it'll all start to come out. So I don't think in a general sense, you're going to find, that level of inaccuracy very easily. Not to say that it can't, but that's why I think Tida posed the question is what is acceptable. And I would think you go on site and you do some quick checks, and you will then very quickly see this building is reasonably accurate. And I keep stressing the word reasonable because the tolerances are like typically, a wall's position 20 millimeters out is probably fine. You very, very seldom find it to the, where do you measure on a brick wall anyway? You know what I mean? That's it's nominally. Okay.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Gary. That gives us
your second question.
Second question is, it's a bit of a contentious question here. I'm part of the EPC training program as well, and this comes up a lot. And according to what we understand from the regulations and so forth, but I would like to get your input from an architectural point of view, is in terms of how does building classification happen, especially if you look at a large office area within an industrial development plant. When is that office portion classified on its own as a G1 and then needs to get an EPC, and when basically is it seen as part of the industrial environment, which could be another classification? So the question is, how's classification done, number one? Is it registered somewhere or something? Can we just look it up? And when is it deemed that within the same structure, but different users or occupancies of a building is then classified as a G1, an A1, and a cuckoo 1, and whatever else, X, Y, Z?
Yeah, no, that is, as you say, quite a contentious issue. And there have been a couple of Building Regulation Review Board hearings on this. It's not a simple answer that I can give you, other than to say that the person that decides on when he submits the drawings to the local authority, if he says it is an industrial building and it is J2 or J3, and it has a small office component, and he doesn't put that in, then the building is simply a warehouse. Now the problem comes in is where, and I actually put that in my last presentation, that I have actually got this addressed. It's not open in front of me at the moment. That the building regulations say that if it is ancillary accommodation, then it need not be classified separately, but where a building has different occupancies, they shall be classified separately. So now let's just go to a bigger picture, so we have like some shops and we have offices like in the downtown, then the shops are definitely going to be classified as what F1 or E1 or whatever it is, and the offices will be G1. However, if you have a warehouse and you have a little Wendy house where the guy, storeman, is going to check out things, that's not going to be a G1. If you have a school and you have a tuck shop, or you have a little shop where people sell uniforms, it shall not be classified separately because it is ancillary to the main function. Now, that is, as you say, very contentious, because I tend to lead towards, like, if you have, say, a data center and there are some offices attached to that, there is a tendency to say, yes, they must be classified separately. But nobody would ever go into an industrial type of environment and build offices. They are simply there to serve the need of people working in the data center. So I would tend to, and my idea would be, tend to ignore them, and they become just ancillary. But it is not clearly defined in the national regulations, and that's part of where the problem comes in. So now, to answer your question a little bit more directly, if you go to the municipality and there is a form that is filled in, it's one of the 4 forms when you submit drawings, the person that fills that in is going to determine what that building is. In other words, if he says, in conjunction with his client, this is a so-and-so and a so-and-so, then it becomes that substantially, and the municipality will view it and approve it related to that. So if I'm now building a warehouse and I don't know what the contents are of people, I'm a courier, and I classify it as, I would have to classify it probably as J2, not as J3, because that would be non-combustible materials. Then I have pegged that building as a certain classification. And if I then write on that form and G1, then those offices are going to be, absolutely, they're going to be offices. And it has lots of implications, and just, this is general. I mean, we had a case like that where the municipality then said, well, now we need fire shutters between the offices and the warehouse, and that's a huge extra cost. And people say, no, but it's ancillary to it. And the municipality says, well, you chose to put a G1 with a J2, and therefore the fire regulations are going to be interpreted this way. So it's quite a complex issue. But it starts off with a person who submits the drawings, determines and tells the municipality, I am building this type of building on this site.
All right. Thanks, Harry. So basically, when we have a industrial building that we need to go to, we first need to get from the municipality side what's the classifications, and if it's nowhere there stated the G1 and it's not part of the regulation 2,000 square meter thingamajig, then we can say, okay, you don't need EPC and we can go on.
I would sort of adopt that attitude, yes, because it depends there. It all goes back to the fundamental approval.
Excellent.
Although just on that point,
yes,
it's highly unlikely you're going to find a 2,000 square meter office attached to a warehouse, I think. But correct me if I'm wrong, but that's quite a substantial building.
Yeah.
Okay.
There are 1 or 2 in big industries, and this is where the issue comes back towards. But thanks.
Christo, thank you for that question. Very important question. Thank you, Jerry, for your answer. Sula had his hand up for quite a while already. Sula, would you like to pose very quickly, please? We need to cut this short.
Okay, thank you. Harry, thanks for the presentation. So I had 2 questions, but one you've already answered. The second, the minimum requirements on a floor plan to be deemed acceptable. Is there further information you can give us to this? And the background to my question is that I've been looking at a couple of plans. Yesterday, we were looking at one for just analysis of an EPC. And you find that in some, there's missing information, like you've got a building and it's got 4 floors, but the floor numbers are not indicated, or they are not really similar to what you've actually indicated. And then what we pick up is that maybe the entity or body has an internal architect, and there might not be certain steps that have been followed. So what would you say are certain minimums that need to be there in a floor plan for you to say you can actually work on this?
Well, I think the minimums would be that you need dimensions of the internal rooms. That's, you need to know how big the various rooms are so that you can calculate and tabulate them. You need that. I mean, there are ways maybe around that. If you take the overall and you take the linear, the running meters of wall minus the doors, you can come to a reasonable assessment that way. I think that type of question, though, is more related to, in my opinion, the way SANIS is going to view your data integrity, and the way in which you acquire the data in your system. So, in other words, saying that, what I'm saying is that that process that's followed to verify must be intact, related to SANIS's demands rather than what I'm trying to address in terms of what's acceptable in a drawing. I mean, the standard says you must determine the net floor area. If you need to determine that and you don't trust the drawings, you've got to go on site. You've got to go and measure them. Simply, that is what it is.
Yeah. So for example,
Jerry, Sula, continue.
Yeah, sorry. So sure, no problem. So for example, I'm looking at a building, and the building shows net floor areas, like the total net floor area of, let's say, that floor, but doesn't have the individual lengths and let's say breadths that were in the diagrams that you indicated. And within the SANS 1544, you need to be able to take away your your storage areas and so forth. So in that instance, are you going back to the client? The document is not signed off. It's not a municipal signed off document and so forth. Do you deem that acceptable, or do you go back to the client? What would you say?
It's a difficult question to answer. Whether I deem it acceptable is a tricky one. I would think that if you doubt that it is, if you doubt that there's what you see on the ground differs from the drawings, then I don't think you have any option but to then verify it physically, because it means that in the SANIS thing that you're working with something that is not trusted and not accurate. Then I would think that you have to then just simply do the long method of going to measure it. Because I don't think the standard is how can I say, uncertain on it. You have to determine the net floor area.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you for the question, Sula. Sula, remember to mute. Thank you. Two more questions, very briefly, and I'm going to read. The first one is actually quite straightforward, and I think you might have touched on it already, Jerry. Is the building plan as is accepted as correct, or does the IB have to verify the size by measuring themselves? That's the question from Yolanda.
Okay, I think as a, I think if it's an as-built drawing, it's probably accurate enough, because it wouldn't, as I said, I don't think that you'll find easily that there are really big variations. There might be a few percent over or under, but generally that would be rather exceptional. So yeah, I think an as-built drawing, a construction type drawing, I would think is probably sufficient.
Thank you, Jerry. Then one more from Friki Milan. When validating the net floor area during the building assessment, would sampling be relevant, and can you provide an example?
I'm not quite sure exactly what is meant by sampling is relevant. I would think in the context of this, if one made some measurements and found that they were accurate, one could then reasonably probably assume that with a gross check over the total building, in other words, measuring its length and breadth, as it were, would probably be acceptable. Yeah, I think that.
Thank you. Thank you,
Jerry. And there's another question from Yolanda, which is a trickier one. When is a storeroom a storeroom? Must it be indicated on the building plan to qualify, or how else does one get this verification? It's a very good question, because buildings on drawings, you've got to indicate the function of the room. So if a storeroom is a storeroom, it should be noted on as a storeroom. And that's a very important kind of thing, depending on the kind of building that it is, might have implications in terms of floor loading, etc. You know, I can't begin to think of all the various options, but if you, for argument's sake, like lawyers often have huge amount of paper in files concentrated in or libraries in these roller stacks and so on, that would be indicated, but people often say, well, we need a storeroom for this, and they just make a storeroom. If it's not indicated on the original drawings as a storeroom, then the client has changed the use, strictly speaking, and I would then think that it's not a storeroom, because a storeroom must be indicated as a storeroom on the original approved drawings. Now, I made this point in, I think, the first time that we discussed this is about if I, when I was a young architect, I wrote on a garage, there was a little teeny section where I'd written workshop, and the building inspector immediately pulled it up and said, no, it's not a workshop, because workshop gives him rights in terms of the building regulations to work after hours and on Saturdays. If he's working there with a saw and he's making too much noise, then we have the right to go and take action. So those titles that are put on drawings are very important. So if it says storeroom on the original approved drawings, it is a storeroom. If somebody puts a few partitions up and they store a couple of odd things in it, I think that's a very gray area. I would be inclined to include it simply because if it's an element that uses conditioned air, it's an element that uses lights and services, it does contribute to the energy use of the building. So this might be kind of splitting hairs, but I think I would be inclined to include it unless it's on the original drawings as a storeroom, in which case I would exclude it. I hope that answers that question for Yolanda.
Really, thank you very much. There was one more question, but we'll leave that one. Jaco, just remind us at the end, if there's time, we'll deal with that one. We need to proceed, and I'd like to introduce the next presenter. Jerry, thank you very much for your presentation and answering questions. Very important topic, this. Thank you. The next presenter is Dr. Frank Duvenage. Frank, did I pronounce it correctly? Is Duvenage or Duvenage?
Hi, Carl. No, it's Duvenage. You're correct. It's the Afrikaans, not the French pronunciation.
Thank you, Frank. Dr. Frank is an engineer with a focus on sustainability. He has a keen interest in experience in water, the water energy nexus. Together with Dr. Janko Vermeulen, they were the first energy consultants to assist their client to receive the first ever EPC in South Africa. And that was for Stellenbosch University, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
They are both also actively involved in the industrial water treatment and industry, helping clients save water on their cooling cycles with their proprietary chemical-free water treatment technologies. Dr. Frank Duvenage, thank you very much for participating and presenting something to us. Over to you today.
Thanks a lot, Carl, and thanks for the opportunity. Also, thanks to Tida for inviting me. And I want to say thanks to Gerry for the detailed presentation. I think I'm a bit out of place here in light of his experience and his detailed knowledge around floor plans as a professional architect with so much experience. I will try to give my 2 cents based on floor plans within the context of EPCs and our experience on the ground, as it were, or in the field. I do think I certainly learned a lot, even from listening to Jerry's discussion around the technicalities around floor plans. I think what we have found in the field is that there are definitely practical limitations, and that's the biggest hurdle to overcome when attempting an EPC is actually not the theoretical or the spirit of EPC, which is to determine energy performance. It is the practical limitations of data availability, the quality of the data, who is the custodian of the data, the building owner, the facilities manager, the investors in the building. So it's a tricky one to navigate when you're actually trying to collect all the relevant data, but it's certainly overcomable, and there are ways and means around each hurdle. And I will try to cover a few of them briefly, but like I said earlier, based on what Gerrie presented, I don't think I'm going to add as much value as I would like. He covered most of the detailed technical questions that I certainly would not have been able to cover. So I'm going to present. I've got 2 slides here. I don't know if I can. All right, yes, I can.
Please proceed.
Thank you. I'm just trying to find. That's interesting. I can't find the screens. Let me just minimize everything. Okay, apologies for this. It's not the tip. There we go. Okay, so can you all see my little PDF?
I can see it. Thank you, Frank.
Okay, I'm just going to make it full screen for what it's worth. So this is an excerpt from a presentation that I did for the Green Building Council also earlier this year. And it's once again just practical takeaways from our experience in the field. I do want to put it out there, a small disclaimer. We are not an accredited inspection body. We partner with accredited inspection bodies to facilitate the process for our energy consulting clients. So I just want to put that out there. So we do not perform the actual detailed audits, since we are not accredited to do so. We help the accredited inspection body and the client see eye to eye and provide the correct information, and that the accredited inspection body can spend as little time as possible on the data and in the field, and have as short a turnaround time as possible. As engineers dealing with clients, that's what's important for us, is to make sure that the client gets what they want as quick as possible and within budget. So this is a few screenshots from a floor plan of an EPC that we performed earlier this year. And what we can see here is, and I'm sure Gerrie will be able to support this, is, okay, obviously I'm not going to give too much detail because it's of a client of ours. But what we can see expressly from this high level is that it's quite simple room layouts or interior spaces layouts. They're all square, and they're all, like Gerrie pointed out earlier, rectilinear. So it's easy to do a quick survey on the floor plan itself, and then to go and take samples on in the field. And I think this is also maybe an answer to, I can't remember who asked the question about sampling. Let me have a look here. Yaku Homan, I think. Sorry. Frikkie Malan, about sampling. I think as part of the SUN's regulations on EPCs, the 15.4, if you read them, there is definitely a need for a physical inspection. You can take as-built floor plans. Obviously, that is the most true indication of what the building looks like, but it is still, the onus rests on the accredited inspection body to go to the building and verify that what the floor plan shows is what is there in real life. And it's for 2 reasons. First of all, it's to determine that the occupancy of the building is what it's supposed to be, G1, A1, A2, A3. And second of all, it's to verify the net floor area. So I think it is definitely necessary for an in-field inspection. And then obviously, if you do have hundreds and possibly thousands of interior spaces or rooms that add up to the net floor area, it's not realistic to expect the accredited inspection body to actually measure each and every single room and use that to verify the floor plans. We had a case for one of the EPCs that we did. We had floor plans for the large main building, but no floor plans for the supporting buildings around it. So we did actually go to the effort, like Harry pointed out, in the absence of floor plans and measured each room in those supporting buildings. Luckily, they were not as large as the main building. So there are cases where you will have to go and measure it up in the absence of floor plans. But when you do have a floor plan that gives you square meters or at least floor area per room, you have to go and take sample measurements. So what we apply is the 90-10 confidence interval sampling rate. 90% of the samples that we take need to be within a 10% margin of error of the reported floor area that we find on the floor plan. So to do that, obviously, there's a lot of admin that needs to go in. If you have a floor plan that's not in the form of a database or at least a spreadsheet with a list of rooms and their areas, you need to digitize that and capture it in a database, because otherwise you're going to be walking around writing down square meters on a floor plan and having to then do the sampling rate in Excel afterwards. So it's much easier to capture it live in a database. So there's a lot of aspects like that can make the whole process easier or more complicated. As we can see with this floor plan, the shapes are simple. So we used a standard laser measurement device. We did go so far as to have ours calibrated. As Harry pointed out, it really isn't necessary. we did it out of respect for the accredited inspection body, and so that if we assist them, we can make sure that our equipment aligns with their protocols. But like Harry pointed out, if you measure at the bottom, the top, and the middle of the room, you're going to get different measurements. Even if you measure on the same spot twice, with your hand shaking or the wind blowing and distracting you, you're going to take different measurements. So the calibration, knowing that your measuring device is within 0.1 millimeter accuracy, that accuracy is less of an issue than the accuracy of you holding the device in the first place. So it's definitely, I agree with Harry on that point. Yes, my first point here is one should not only focus on the net floor area in terms of the areas that form part of the occupancy of the building. You also need to focus on the excluded areas, as was mentioned in the previous presentation, storerooms and parking areas and exterior areas. You need to verify that those are actually also within the as reflected on the building plans, and that their total area is what is reflected in reality, so that you can deduct that from the net floor area and calculate it accurately. In the excluded areas, you need to do a sample of what electrical loads are installed there and servicing those areas, because as Harry also pointed out in the SUNS 1544 regulations, if they constitute more than 10% of the building's consumption, then they need to be displayed separately on the EPC. So there's a lot of aspects so this is now consumption. It's not necessarily connected to floor plans, but if you're in an excluded area on your floor plan and you can see that there are large loads or consuming energy consuming equipment, you need to take note of them as well as part of your spatial verification exercise. So and then my final point on this slide, review plans before you visit. That is really, I mean, like I said in the Green Building Council presentation earlier this year, it's very common knowledge, but I mean, if you don't prepare and you don't know what to expect when you get to site, it really does make your time on site just so much longer. Going through the floor plans and building up an intimate understanding of the layout and what to expect on site does make the site visit shorter and obviously help you stay within budget, because that's for the client what they worry about. So if I move on to the next slide here, this is now an example of a bit more complex building. It's not, the shape is, first of all, there's the shape itself is rounder, and these floor plans did not have floor area, so we had to determine a way to capture it from the floor plans themselves, as Harry pointed out. Then we built up an interior space register. Also, the client did not have such a database of the rooms, so we had to digitize that, and then we had to go to the field with the accredited inspection body and do the measurement and verification with them. So it does, there's definitely going to be easier buildings and more complex buildings. And then if I end this share, I just want to share another screen quickly. Let's see if this works. Oh, there we go. Okay. So I take it you can see this building plan.
I can see it, Frank.
Okay, thank you, Carl. So this is an EPC that we're also currently busy with. I'm not going to move around too much to give away the client's details, but it's a large building. It's got a lot of floors, more than 30 vertical floors. Obviously, each floor is similar to the one above and below it, unless you're in the basement areas and on the toppest, the most top floors. The rest of the floors have a similar layout, but you've got a core, and then you've got the surrounding area or the surrounding office space around the core, and which is generally open plan. This is now the floor, the ground floor, so you don't have the core and the surrounding open plan around it, but you do have parking on one side, which also needs to be verified as excluded spaces. So it can get really tricky really fast. And especially like Harry pointed out, they do need to name each room so that you know what its purpose is. But they are obscure. It's difficult sometimes with open areas that they don't delineate the total, the name of each space. For example, here is reception and OM jockeys, but it doesn't, there's no clear delineation between the two, and this area does not have its own room number as is indicated in these oval shapes. So it can get interesting. This floor plan, once again, there are more than 30 floors, but they also don't have square meters. So we need to go and capture each one separately, and it's quite a tedious process. And then you've got issues like these circular columns. That also, now the question is, when you go to site and you actually use a laser measurement device, you're going to take the length and the width, and you're going to multiply it for square meters. Are you going to exclude this half hemisphere of area, or are you not? So when you're digitizing this sheet, does it make sense to exclude it or not? So all of these questions do come up, and you take it as it comes, basically. So yeah, we've got a large open area with a wall separating the reception desk from this seating area. When you're on site, are you going to measure from the farthest end to this furthest end, or are you going to just measure up to this wall and isolate this square and then split it into different squares? Because at the end of the day, sure, you have the as-built floor plans, yeah, and that's great. But first of all, they don't give indication of square of floor area. So you need to go and capture it, and then you need to go and verify it in the field. So you want to prepare yourself to be able to verify it easily without having to measure small triangles and small rectangles. And I just want to point out once again, if you can verify a portion of this area within an acceptable level of accuracy, then you can say that, okay, I accept that the rest of this area is also as indicated on the floor plan. So that all forms part of the whole physical inspection and verification exercise. So yeah, I don't have much more to add. I think Gerrie covered really most of the technical aspects. There's one thing that I always say in these presentations, and that's it's think really practical. You need to be able to move through the client's building without interrupting the client's activities. That's important. You need to do it within the specified time. You need to respect their safety protocols and their tenants' work ethic. Wear comfortable shoes because you're going to be on your feet a lot. Take all the equipment you need in terms of clipboards, pens, laser measurement devices. Don't bother with tape measurers. That's going to annoy everybody. And yeah, be prepared. Familiarize yourself with the floor plans before you actually go to site. So yeah, I don't have much more to add. I think Gerrie gave a very long and detailed presentation. So I'm going to keep mine brief so that Mariki also has time to give her presentation. And then maybe we can move on to the questions. So you are welcome to ask any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Frank Divenage. There's quite a few interesting comments in the chat room, so you can go through those. I've not seen any questions for Dr. Frank, but please, if you've got any, raise your hand or write it down. Sula, you've got your hand up. Thanks,
Doctor. Just a question: how long did this, your site visit take? If you were to just estimate time-wise, so when you went to do the verification of the measurements for that selected building.
Okay, so that also slots in nicely with something that Gerrie mentioned earlier that I did want to comment on, but I forgot actually. And that is that it's not necessarily the size of the building that determines how long it's going to take. It is certainly the complexity of the building and the availability of adequate and informative data. That's what determines how long it's going to take. So for a small building, the first EPC we did for Stellenbosch University was it was just over 3,000 square meters, so small, relatively speaking, on the EPC scale of things. That took about 4 hours. And the reason was simply because it was the first one. We needed to familiarize ourselves with the processes that need to be followed. Having access makes it quicker. And during these strange times that we are living in with COVID and everybody working from home, you won't believe how difficult it is to get access to offices because everybody's working from home. So it's strange things like that that can complicate the process. Then you need to try to find other interior spaces or rooms that are open for access, that you don't need a special key or card to have to get access to the room. So it's having a security guard accompany you who has what they call a skeleton key or a card to access everywhere, and he can make sure that you don't do anything fishy, so that you can give the client a peace of mind, and he can physically open the doors and close the doors for you. That makes the process much quicker. So preparing properly for site access helps a lot to shorten the time. So for the small buildings, yeah, it's difficult to say. It depends on how adequately you prepare the site access.
Thank you.
Thank you for that answer and question, Sula. Dumasani, you've had your hand up.
Yes, I just wanted to ask on that example that you just gave us with the circular, what you call those beams or whatever. That do you have to subtract that to from your net? What exactly did you do in that example? Those circular columns.
Yeah. So in the field, we'll measure the net floor area with the laser meter, the rectilinear floor area, and then we can, if we want to be pedantic, measure the diameter of the column and subtract it. But this also brings me to the point that Gerrie made, and I'm very glad he made that point, is because that's exactly the approach that we use in the field. Is if that, let's say that column is 600 millimeters in diameter, so it's less than a square meter floor area. If that 0.4 square meters doesn't push the client into a different rating category, then we're not going to bother with it, because it's going to complicate the whole process from there on forward and make the calculations more complicated and the time longer. So we take it into consideration, just like Harry mentioned, in light of the EPC rating, not in light of the up to the third decimal millimeter floor area. So if it doesn't affect the client's rating, then we don't make the effort to include or exclude it, especially in the field, because it takes long. Then technically you have to verify, or each column you need to measure and exclude after the fact, or you need to measure each wall thickness or partitioning thickness to exclude it from the net floor area. So it can get really tedious. And if it doesn't affect the client's rating, then we don't take it into consideration.
Thank you, Dr. Frank. That was actually a very good presentation. You won't believe it. Being practical, it shows that the challenges being experienced, you don't learn better than the problems others experience. So that's quite an important presentation that you presented to us and your talk. There might be more questions. You're welcome to add more questions to the chat room to the previous presenters, and we will try and deal with it at the end. But I'm going to introduce the next speaker. And the next speaker is, let me just get the details. And the next speaker is Markie Kloete. Markie Kloete holds a BCom honors degree in financial management and is experienced project manager, a certified energy auditor, and a member of Mensa with more than 10 years experience, management experience in consulting, engineering, and energy management field. She was the technical manager for the National Department of Public Works EPC pilot program, which was advisor to DTPW's Education Infrastructure Chief Directorate on the EPC rollout for 1,500 schools. Over to you, Markie. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Carl. I appreciate it. Yes, DTPW stands for Department of Transport and Public Works. So I just want to quickly differentiate between, where we're looking at. I'm going to talk about how we did things from a government point of view. So National Public Works will typically be responsible for your, their mandate is for the prisons, the army bases, police stations, etc., etc. Provincial is for schools and hospitals mainly, and they will also have office buildings. So I'm going to look at the large portfolios, and I just want to say this was completely unexpected. We didn't even realize that this is going to happen. And if you look at the actual paper, it actually said that government building is 1,000 square meters. It's not 2,000 square meters as the private sector guys. And, just looking at our portfolios, I mean, it's huge. National Public Works has got in the vicinity of about 90,000 properties. Western Cape has got about 3,000 properties, of which 1,500 is schools. And KZN, for instance, has got 10,000 buildings. So the sheer size of this makes for the actual physical site visits almost impossible. I really appreciate what Jerry said in terms of all the, the calculations, and you want to do this as correctly as possible. But having said that, there's a lot of other constraints that you will have in government. So we were thinking about more of having a desktop approach and maybe just giving some sort of information, giving that desktop approach and approach the verifying bodies on that side and say, well, this is what we did, and we will give you the information on the desktop approach and then verify it from there. I have cleared this with SANA, so it is a possibility for us to do that. Just to give you an idea, there's budget cuts coming in for provincial government, a lot of budget cuts coming in, and the mandate for education infrastructure is to build schools. But yes, the EPC is mandatory, so you need to be cognizant of the actual budget that is available for you and what you need to achieve in terms of the energy performance certificate. They also have annual performance plans, which they get audited against, and the energy performance certificates doesn't necessarily form part of it, which means that they might not be budgeted just yet. It doesn't mean it won't come in, but it will take a little bit of time. So the education infrastructure guys started to gear up for this process in the meantime, just to make sure that they've got the information. Just one nice snag that we've got to deal with is that the utilities are being paid by the government bodies, not by the provincial department themselves. So we had no idea what the guys actually paid for electricity. So you either had to go to the governing body, which may or may not be a good idea because some of them do manage very well, some doesn't manage all the schools very well. So the better idea was to approach City of Cape Town for the municipal data. But the crude thing that we had to do with building plans is those things aren't available. Even if you have, some of them available, chances are we had very, very little of them. And I spoke to SANAS and I asked them if it's possible for us to do the very, very crude thing and go to Google Maps and say, you know what, this is our school. It's more than 1,000 square meters. Yes, we will include it in our plan. And then basically use the Google Maps minus 5%. And SANAS thankfully said, yes, we're allowed to do that because of the sheer size of the portfolio, but we have to be consistent. So it can't just say, okay, 2% here, 4% there. We have to say, and have some sort of verification that 5% is possibly the correct deduction that you make of your plan that you get from Google Maps. Because at the end of the day, you're looking at a benchmark that you want to do for your EPC. You want to know whether you're an A or B or C rating. Now, schools are not really a very large energy consumer. Some of the initial indications that we had for schools were that the majority of them were an A rating. Especially the rural ones, some of them don't even have electricity. So there's not much that we can really do in terms of that. But yeah, so ours is going to be very, very crude. So the idea what we wanted to do is we've got a system called eMerge, which is a property management system within the Western Cape. Maybe speak to the municipalities and have discussions with the municipalities to do a data dump of information into that system and add the building sizes by adding it by calculating on Google, and then create your energy performance certificates from there and get the verifying body to verify that particular process. That was the most practical thing we can come up with, and also the most cost-effective way to calculate EPCs for such a large portfolio. Having said that, some of our other buildings are not necessarily schools. So in that sense, we need to more look at what Jerry said in terms of measuring it as thoroughly as possible. Hopefully there will be building plans, so we will, for those buildings, we'll have to look at it at a different way. But for schools, the practicality we looked at was to maybe do it as a desktop exercise rather than going out to field. And that's basically what I'm going to say in terms of this. That was my experience in terms of the ones I did at national. We had a big problem with data. Building plans was a huge problem for us, and some we did actually calculate by using the measurements. That worked very well, but it's not possible for all buildings. So I think from a government perspective, Google Maps is probably going to be our best option to go forward.
Thank you, Markie. Always good to hear the challenges and opportunities that we see, because remember, challenge is always an opportunity. So thank you for that. I don't see any specific questions to you, but perhaps I can raise one. You often mentioned that you got buy-in or agreement from SANAS.
Yes.
I'm concerned that I need to adhere to things that you saying SANAS agreed to, and I'm not aware of it.
I did. I had a meeting with her, with Linda.
I'm not saying it's not true. What I'm saying is the communications need to go to the assessors as well. I'm an assessor. and we're not aware of it, but I'll take it up with Linda. Don't worry. But be aware of that. The interpretation might be different at the specific assessment stage. Eh?
Absolutely, absolutely.
So let's deal with that when it comes. I see there's a question in the chat room from Faran. Were there any targets set in terms of energy efficiency for schools?
In terms of the green building sector plan, all buildings, all government buildings had to have a deduction of 10% in electricity. So schools will form part of that. But they're not using a lot of electricity to start off with. I'm not sure that they actually did a lot in terms of interventions to actually achieve that particular goal.
Sure. Thank you, Markie. Markie, another question from our side. Do you know perhaps how DPW is planning to deal with the certification? Are they going to appoint private inspection bodies to assist them in issuing certificates, or are they looking to go to a different approach and appoint in-house, or whatever the case might be?
DTPW has got a lot of in-house architects as well as engineers. So they will probably, the idea is that they will generate the EPCs themselves and then get a verification body on there to verify that. However, the rest of the other provinces that I've spoken to will most likely not follow this approach. National will probably also not follow the approach. They'll probably get a body to assist them to do the actual calculation. So, but it's up to the actual region and province to decide for themselves how they're going to go about this.
Okay, thank you for that, Markie. I see there's a question, and perhaps I should respond to it, but because it's not indicating to who it should be, but perhaps you can help me, Markie. Can this desktop approach for certain government buildings be verified and approved by SANAS? I'm with the Department of Public Works, KZN, and we have the same challenge. Markie, perhaps you would like to respond first.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you'll be able to, I would clarify this with SANAS as well, but you will most likely be able to do the same thing, that where you get your building size verified on Google, and maybe you'll definitely get your accredited provider to verify how you came to that particular calculation and to that size buildings, and then and get the accredited verifier to follow that same process. You've got the same amount of buildings, I think even more than we have. So yeah, I think SANAS will assist in this regard.
Thank you, Markie. Yes, often keep in mind that it's often not even the SANAS's decision, because the assessor and the inspection body needs to agree as to the approach was suitable for the intent or achieving the objective. So it's not as simple as it might sound off the bat, but we do need to look into how to get this done and at a reasonable cost and a reasonable speed. So,
sorry,
yeah.
Another thing on that, in terms of the accreditation bodies, and government is probably not going to be allowed to just appoint one. So there'll have to be some sort of framework contract where a couple of, 3 or 4, 10 of them would be appointed. And then they will probably have insight into how the calculations were done or how they are going to do it. I mean, that's probably going to be up to them. However they feel comfortable it, as long as it is as long as it is cost effective.
Thank you, Marika, for your support. I agree with you. Jason has a question. What is the energy benchmark usage range for schools? It's not really relevant to this discussion, but if it's very short answer, please proceed, Mariki.
I'm not entirely sure, actually. I don't think schools really, like, their usage is so small. I'm not, your older Model C schools will have higher usage, but your rural schools will have such low electricity ratings that they're basically as green as they possibly can be. So
thank you.
Answer there.
Can I possibly come in there?
Jay, please do.
Yeah, tables 2 and 3 of XI detail it. It's A3 occupancy, and in Pretoria it would be 400 kilowatt hours per square meter per annum. It's there, it's in XA. Those figures are not a mystery, but on a point, I've had a couple of connectivity problems here, but on a point that Marky was raising, schools, certainly here in Gauteng, and I imagine in the Cape, are standard type schools. In other words, there is a model that is used, and it is, whether it's a 750 or an 800 or whatever it is, pupil school, the column spacings, it's been worked out over years to make it the most economical kind of structure to build, etc. So I think I am, and I must express my concern that it's sort of like a Google Maps type of thing, and how one really tracks that through in valid data that one can use later. I have a question mark, but if one does one school and you can very quickly verify that it is this type of school, I think you're going to come to a fairly reasonable answer. Certainly as I say, in Gauteng, the GDE schools have got very similar things. There will be a school hall, whether it's twisted this way or that way or facing a different direction, but the school classrooms and walkways and all the rest of it is relatively standard. So just a thought there, Marky, but I would do one or two and build up a database from that, but I am expressing a concern on a sort of, just minus 5%. Okay, I'll leave it at that.
There's going to be some sort of determination based on, what you have, what sort of building plan. So it is going to be, it's crude, but it's going to be as informed as possible.
Thank you, Jerry. Very important point that you made, and things to note. SANA's assessor is not going to be happy with the Google Maps. That's why I asked the question regarding SANA's agreements. So, and that was touched on as briefly in the chat as well, where Yolanda raised, it's actually just a comment, SANA should allow relaxation for all, not only specific entities. Very important, and although I agree with that, if SANA starts allowing anything for EPCs, there might be an argument to make for allowing this similar approach in MAB and then other inspection bodies or accreditation fields. So it's not as simple as it might sound. And I'm not talking on behalf of SANA's. I'm not a SANA's employee, not a full-time employee anyway. So they need to respond to those things. And that's why I said we need to have that discussion with SANA's in agreement, but I'll take it up with them as well, because I've got a body to accredit it very soon. So, yeah. Any other questions? There's nothing more. There's one question that Johanna raised, but it was answered by Frank. She issued it to Frank and he responded to it in the chat. You can have a look there yourselves. I'm not going to repeat it here. If there's anything else, you're free to raise your hand or write it in the chat room if you like.
Maybe could I just respond to some things that Frank said? And I must say,
please, Jerry, please.
It was a marvelous presentation.
It was.
Out of hard experience, I've learned exactly what you have said. Where you go rushing in with a tape measure, you're going to go back and you're going to go back and you're going to go back 3 times or more. It is about the preparation part of it. And I think that was really, really an excellent point, is if you must prepare and get all your ducks in a row. You go in and you get the data you need. And that's absolutely, I'd like to stress that I have, as I say, measured several buildings and houses up. And when you get to the drawing board, as it were, behind your computer, then suddenly, oops, I don't know this. And it means having to go back. So that is a really, really, congratulations on a good presentation, because it highlights a lot of the issues of the on-site type of work. Thanks for that.
Thank you, Jerry. I fully support what you just said. Jason's got his hand up. Jason, you're welcome. What was your question?
Hello. Thanks for the presentation and all the information. I'd just like to ask the rating that's given for places of instruction. that 420 that you guys are speaking about. How well does that compare, and how realistic is that for our schools in South Africa?
Jason, to you, are you directing your question?
Possibly to Gerry, because he also responded on it. But to Markie, yeah.
Markie, perhaps you would like to go first, and then we'll hear from Jerry.
Sorry, can you just repeat the question? I didn't quite catch it.
Sula?
Jason?
It was Jason, sorry.
My question is just, so the standard, it does give you a number, but how realistic is that number? And just to play open cards, we've done a few, we've got some information of schools, and we've basically worked out their energy usage intensities, and it varies a lot from this number. This number is too big for schools. And as you do say that, well, what do schools have? They don't have a lot. I still think though that we can save a lot of energy in schools.
Yeah. Yes, we've accounted that some of the first calculations we've done is that the majority of them came out at an A rating. So there's no real room for improvement from there on. Carl, I just want to touch on something else. You're going to get a lot of possibly difficulties in terms of budgets, in terms of getting your floor plans ready and all that type of thing, because a lot of these guys, especially other guys, are going to say, well, I don't have budget for this, and my budget is going for school building as opposed to EPC. So just to make sure that if it isn't, while it is very, very important that you get the actual plans right, you need to be cognizant that there's a lot of budgetary restrictions at the moment, and you need to make sure that it is as good as possible. And for schools especially, a lot of them is going to be A ratings. A lot of them will say, well, what's the point of this? Because we are, it is a mandatory request, but it is a very high, they're always going to be very high ratings. So yeah, it is going to be an issue sometime.
Good day. Sorry, I can't raise my hand. Can I mention something?
Sorry, Barry.
Sorry, Barry. Yes, please go ahead.
So this is Barry speaking. First of all, just just on the standards of the A rating. So I think it's common cause that the current 10400 XA numbers are very lenient. That was the first energy efficiency component of a building regulation in South Africa done 10 years ago, based on very little data. So a lot of it was modeled, a lot of the information was taken from Australian data, and it is very lenient. The current 10400 XA that is out for public comment now is more realistic for South African conditions, and the figures are a lot more stringent. So we've done a couple of examples. Typically, buildings that were A or B can drop down as far as D rating now on the new 10400 XA figures, because bearing in mind 1544 is linked to 10400 XA. So, but if anyone gets an EPC now under the current 10400 XA, obviously they will get a good rating, and that will be valid for 5 years. But if they get it done after 10400 XA, the current version is adopted and approved, then 1544 will change as well, and it will be a lot more difficult to get an A or B or C. Extremely more difficult. So, there is a timing issue here. We don't want to use that as a carrot to say, try to get as many done before the 10400 XA is changed, because I mean that's just not right. But it is a reality that one can mention. While I've got the phone, I joined a little bit later, and I'm driving now from an EPC event, so apologies for that. But I did catch the end of the presentations and discussions. I'd just like to thank everyone for putting this together and for the contributions made. I think we should have more of these generally discussing, but then also now looking at specifically at individual case studies going forward of the successful ones. And when I say successful, I mean the companies that have got EPCs, not necessarily all A rated, but some of the ones that are battling a bit and that have got less than a D rating, because there's some really phenomenal learning experiences coming out from the practical exercise. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you for that contribution. So I see your hand, Krista, but before that, Jerry, did you want to comment on the question posed?
I think, yeah, I mean, I think Barry covered it. It's exactly what he said, is that when XA first came out, there wasn't a great deal of knowledge, and there was modeled notional buildings and so on. And part of the bigger picture is to now start getting the EPC so that one can then refine figures. Now, I think Barry covered that. Just that on the comment about the 420 or 400, yeah, it's of course related to the climatic zones, which in the new XA are also going to change slightly. So it's going to be a new ball game. But the big trajectory is to try and get savings all the way down to 2030, and that's the government's policy paper on it. I'm not that familiar with all the details. I can't really speak to that, but I think Barry covered what I wanted to say. Thanks.
Thank you, Jerry. Krista, your question?
Thank you, Carl. Harry, Barry, welcome. It's a long time since we've chat, mate. Frank and then Marky, thank you as well. A couple of things. Let me just get my hand down, sorry. I was away for about 5 or 10 minutes. I had to take a call, so it may have been covered or not. But based on Jason's question, I'm assuming it hasn't. We just need to remember that the 10400 XA values are total values excluding plug loads. That means computers and so forth. This makes eventually an EPC inherently, with everything else done correctly, the EPC value is then inherently conservative, as the energy that we use to calculate the KPI is then including plug loads, of course, whereas the 10400 XA excludes plug loads. So we've got that slight hurdle to overcome. So that is how it works. In order to bring in plug loads into simulations and so forth is very difficult, because that means it's us humans, the most random thing on earth. Just look at the rate politicians change their mind, then you know how random we are. So to include plug loads in a standard is always a bit difficult. Then another question, it might have been covered. I'm not sure. Please tell me if it has, then I will go through the recordings. This will go out to, again, Harry, Frank, Marky, and whomever else can answer me on this. If you look at a place like, for instance, a school or even an office park, you've got 5 buildings in them, each of them 1,000 squares. According to the regulations, which says per building, more than 2,000 square. Now people will go over and say, okay, this is still, it's one site, it's one building, so you've got 5,000 squares, you need to get an EPC. I understand it. The regulation says per building. Whether there are 20 buildings on site or 1 building on site, you look at per building. Therefore, most of your typical normal schools won't need to get an EPC, because they've got small separate classrooms and so forth. I would like your opinion on this. Otherwise, please tell me if it has been covered. Thank you.
Perhaps Jerry to start.
Yeah, it's a good question. In a lot of the discussions relating to the registration and the whole SANAS thing of who can do what, this topic did come up. It's sort of, as you say, it's campus type in situations. I am, however, of the opinion that it is still per building. In other words, on a university campus or a campus of various buildings, it should be done per building. And I'm not quite sure how the electrical metering issues work, but because if you really do need then sub-metering for each building. But it is, the analogy is, it's like having a fleet of delivery vehicles or whatever, and you want to assess them, and you'll see one of them is outstanding. Then it gives you the opportunity to delve further in. There might be good, valid reasons why it is so. And I think that's, on a campus type thing, I would think that the common sense approach would be absolutely to do per building, because it makes sense to do that. But it might imply some small additional cost to sub-meter at the building level. Now, I know that like some things, schools have one connection, 1 meter, and buildings often do have that. But on a campus type thing, I'm not quite sure because I'm not an engineer, electrical engineer, whether sub-metering is brought in, but I would think this is a kind of implied that one needs to go and do that. I don't know if that addresses that question, but
absolutely. Thanks.
It's also a question of where you have, although shops have not now been included, but if you have multiple energy carriers, so that you have gas and you have electricity and you have solar and all the rest of it, you've got to aggregate those, and that's really an important thing. So you get complex buildings, simple buildings, and campus style are the 3 big sort of classifications. But yeah, I think as Barry alluded to, we have to get going with doing this work, and it will be refined hopefully with the next version of XA, with the next version of 1544, etc.
No, thanks. You, Gerrie.
Thank you, Gerrie.
If I may, the reason I asked this question is basically this was asked a lot during training and so forth as well, and we gave exactly the same answer. We actually went as far and says, and this is where the gray area comes in. If you have a campus building, but all of them share services like hot water, air conditioning, and do you then treat them as 1 or 2? And this is where we say, well, you need to then actually make a stand, and then the authorities will sit around a table, discuss it, and let it know. But there are other questions and queries coming in. Now, for instance, a school that needs to all of a sudden do an EPC and pay for that, they don't have the funds, but they don't need to do so, but they've been led to believe that they have to do so. So this is exactly why I wanted a more direct query on this. And then, of course, you get the same thing where you have a shopping mall with different shops and stuff, but then you look at the building owner clause, which says the building owner, which owns the shopping mall, and then you go to classifications. Am I correct in that scenario as well, Gerrie?
Well, I would think one of the first SAEE presentations, one touched on that. If you have like the new Leonardo Towers in Sandton, there is a residential component, and there is a hotel, and there is an office component. That's going to be quite an interesting one to see how that's managed. And I think there are some shopping malls that have got offices attached to them, but I think that's really where then, you know, the owner has to go and then start looking at sub-metering to take that component out.
Yeah. Yeah, and luckily sub-metering is way cheaper than paying unnecessary for an EPC. But yeah, thank you.
No, I'm not sure that when you said that schools don't have to do it, according to my understanding of the regulations, absolutely schools do have to, because they're A3.
Yeah, but if they're more than 2,000 squares, or 1,000 if it's a public school, 1,000 squares.
Yeah, if it's more than for the government sector or provincial sector, more than 1,000 net square meters, it has to.
Yeah, per building. Yes.
Per building.
Yeah, yeah. So many of your schools do have separate pieces of buildings, all one school, one site, but none of them are really more than 1,000 squares.
No, so I think that I think was also covered in an earlier thing, is that if you have a sectional title type of office development, there's a whole lot of different owners. I think certainly the intention of the regulations are that it as a complex, and it's registered that way, it's one site, it's one piece of land, has to then issue an EPC. So you will have to aggregate the various components. I mean, to say a school has got one block and another block is, I think, not really defined, but it's certainly not within the spirit of what regulations are asking for.
Agree, but that goes against what you just said. Looking at your example of a fleet of vehicles.
No. I'm thinking of places like the CSR, where there's it's a large complex, a university campus. There are many lecture rooms, there are many office blocks. They are individual buildings. A school doesn't really, in a way, have individual buildings. They're all linked together. I'm thinking in terms of, like, say, these office parks that I drive past on the highway, where there might be, there's several buildings, but they're not interlinked with links and so on. They are separate, discrete structures, whereas a school doesn't have one set of classrooms and another set of classrooms as a discrete structure. I think it's a fine line, maybe, and I take your point there.
That's the thing, that's the fine line, yes. Where do you draw that? Yes. And you touched on it in terms of where they are interlinked. Then I tend to say also lean towards your side. Yes, let's treat it as one building interlinked. But if there are separate structures, you walk in the rain from one structure to another structure, something, then you can treat that as a single building, although there are 5 single buildings on that site.
Sorry, I just want to come in on this. So the EPC is linked to the cadastral information of that ERF. So if that ERF has 3 buildings on it, and the main building is classified as a school, surely for that ERF, the other buildings around it used for ancillary requirements forms together the total square meterage required for an EPC. So if you have an office park with a lot of buildings, if the whole park has one ERF number or one cadastral registration, then all the buildings will form part of that one EPC. But if the office park has 10 buildings on it and there's only 5 cadastral registrations, it should be linked to that cadastral registration, because that is how the EPC is set up to be displayed.
I must say, Yolanda, it's a
if I could also just weigh into the argument, I don't think there's, so we're getting many inquiries, and especially office parks, and we're getting office parks that are dominated by one tenant. So, a big mining house, if you look at their precinct, I won't mention their name, in downtown Johannesburg, they own, 15 buildings, all in a precinct, all owned by the same mining house, but different buildings. And we've taken legal opinion on it. Jerry's original response is that it is per building structure. So we're finding there's a couple of schools that are doing EPCs now. The bigger schools, I could mention some of them here in Gauteng and in Western Cape. You do need to look at each building facility, standalone facility on the school site. It's got nothing to do with the meter. So, the case I mentioned, the mining, they said, but this is all fed from 1 meter. So, but the regulation and the standard does not define the property as by its electrical connection point or anything else except its building structure. And so on the schools, unless there's an individual structure that is 1,000 meters and above in a public school or a private school, which we've also got, it has to be 2,000 square meters above, they would not need an EPC. And the larger majority will not need EPCs. I'm talking about your standard middle of the range small primary school, because they don't have individual buildings that are above 1,000 square meters. So that's the one point. It's not linked to consumption. It's not linked to meters. It's not linked to bills. It's not linked to tenants. You have to look at it per building structure. The other point where you mentioned, for example, shopping malls. So shopping malls are excluded from the regulation and for this regulation, but you could have a bank or offices, as Jerry said, a shopping mall with an office complex. then the 10% dominant occupancy part of the regulation comes in. If the dominant occupancy is 10% or more of the total area of that facility, then the dominant occupancy will have to get an EPC. It's highly unlikely. So a good example is in a hospital. You have a hospital building, and then you have multiple doctors' consulting rooms in the hospital building. Each one of them are a business on their own. They're part of the total hospital, but their businesses, their consulting rooms individually are less than 1,000 square meters. If they happen to, let's say, the blood group happens to be more than 10% of the total occupancy of the hospital, unlikely, then that laboratory would typically need to get an EPC. Otherwise, they then fall within the dominant occupancy, which is a shopping mall or hospital, and they are not covered in the current regulations in terms of requiring an EPC. So one has to look at each case, quite clearly. But the rule of thumb is it's individual buildings, even.
Okay, it seems like we've lost Barry.
Multiple buildings, one tenant.
Barry, you're breaking off severely. Because I'd like to allow Frank to just respond, because he had his hand up for quite a while now. Frank, please respond. I'm not sure if Barry is still online.
Yeah, I can hear you guys clearly, but I think Frank can give a good example with the University of Stellenbosch. Is a good example to illustrate.
Thank you, Barry. We don't hear you all that well. Please continue, Dr. Frank.
Okay, thanks. This is an interesting conversation, and I do want to point out that it might be deviating a bit from the technical aspect of floor plans, but it certainly is a contentious issue for EPCs in general. And I think, I'm not sure who mentioned the word spirit of EPCs. I think it was Harry, and it immediately caught my ear because it's something that I also use to bring these kind of discussions to the central point back, to bring it back home. And that is that at the end of the day, the goals of energy performance certificates in South Africa is to establish an understanding of the role that commercial buildings play in the energy consumption landscape within South Africa. And for now, those commercial buildings are 4 occupancy classes, as we all are aware. And the idea is that we are building a database nationally, but also bringing building owners into a realm of awareness of what their energy consumption is and what their responsibility is associated with that energy consumption. So with that as the spirit of EPCs, if you do now have a developer that builds a large office park with, let's say, 10,000 square meters total of office space, but each building is less than 2,000 squares, he can then, in essence, get away without an EPC. That goes against the spirit of EPCs. In that sense, the office park or the campus would then, in total, need to undergo an energy performance certification process for the whole park as a campus. And interestingly enough, obviously, I'm sure everybody is aware, especially those who work with the SANA standards, that they are classified as simple buildings, complex buildings, and campuses. And ultimately, I mean, that applies to schools as well. If you have schools that have 5,000 square meters of training or educational space, A3, then but they're all individually smaller than 2,000 square meters, you need to, within the spirit of EPCs, have them undergo the EPC process. So with Stellenbosch, as an example, after we did the first EPC for their admin building, they gave us the full portfolio for 58 of their buildings. Once again, as I'm not sure, CA van der Merwe is your name, Chris?
Christo.
Christo. As Christo pointed out, you first need to determine, us as energy consultants taking part in the EPC space, we first had to determine for them which of their buildings actually qualify for mandatory EPCs. All right, so that's the first step. Obviously, you don't want to go and exploit a school in a rural area who does not know about EPCs and come and threaten them with penalties and force them to get an EPC. This whole process, and that because that goes against the spirit of EPC. So I might be a bit idealistic, but if you keep the spirit of EPCs in mind, it does tend to simplify these kind of questions. So Stellenbosch University, we help them evaluate 400 buildings that they have across 4 campuses, and we identified 58. At that point, they have 2 new buildings that have come online, but obviously they need to settle into their energy consumption for 2 years before they are considered mandatory. So 58 buildings at the time that require mandatory EPCs. So now the question can be asked, are these all on one campus? Well, some of them are on one campus, some of them are on completely separate locations. Should we give an EPC for the campus in totality or for the building on its own? If we look at the definition of a building, like Gary pointed out in his presentation, it's let's put it bluntly, 4 walls and a roof that uses lighting and air conditioning to service a certain occupancy class. So then do we have to group them together or do we look at them individually? You have complex buildings that have very strange delineations. Do we then look at that building separately, or is it part of a cluster? Because I mean, it's within on the same cadastral information. So these questions can definitely become complex. But once again, if you look at it within the spirit of what the EPC aims to achieve in South Africa, it does simplify those questions. So I just wanted to give my 2 cents on that matter. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to make those my concluding remarks. I have to sign off and move on to the next meeting. Once again, Tira and Carol, thank you for the opportunity. Motlatlu, thank you for the admin. And all of the best to everybody taking part in this exciting stage in South African energy efficiency.
Dr. Frank, thank you very much for your participation. We really appreciate it. Thank you, and you may go. Guys and ladies, we already 5 minutes over our time. Christo had his hand up briefly, and Yolanda has his hand up all the time still. Perhaps we can deal with those 2 questions and very briefly, please, because we don't want to occupy the presenter's time for too much. Yolanda, you first.
Nee, ek is nou right.
Okay, thank you. Christo, your question quickly. Thank you.
Thank you. Frank, yes, absolutely. Frank, I agree with you on that side. Gary, with your side as well. However, what we've learned from the M&V space as well, and this is what's going to happen with EPC, it is seen as a grudge purchase at this stage. It's something we have to do now. We have to pay now. And I specifically mentioned and drawing schools here as their budgets are absolutely limited. And yes, going by the spirit of what it is an excellent thing. But the moment lawyers get involved, it goes to what Barry says at the end of the day. And that's why they got legal representatives and feedback on how to properly interpret what has been said for now. Because it will happen at some stage. Therefore, I think let's follow the safer route. If someone is willing to go by the spirit and do this whole thing, by all means, yes, do so. But when you get to places like schools where budget is limited and so forth, I would look at it from a sort of a lawyer's point of view, just to be sure. Because otherwise, if you sell them that you need to do an EPC and it comes back they did not have to do so, it will become a financial battle for paybacks and all that sort of thing. So unfortunately, that's also the case we need to look at. But excellent. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Christo. I'd like to close off with one question that was posed and address it to Barry and also get Barry's views because this is important. The question, Barry, is what happens if a building gets an E or F rating? Will it result in any legislative implications? Barry, please, can you respond to that?
Okay, yeah, that question comes up. Thanks, Carl. Yeah, my signal is a bit better now.
It sounds better, yes.
Yeah, so, okay, practically, and once again, in the spirit, let's use that word, because it is about the spirit, nothing's going to happen. You can't be penalized through EPC legislation. You can't be penalized through the Energy Act. You can't be penalized from an energy point of view at all, if you're a G rating or even below. But the practical implementation, if right now the D is the benchmark and it is the compliance with 10400 XA, if you are below a D, that says your building is not compliant in terms of the building regulations. And your building control officer in the municipality can, by looking at the certificate, condemn that building because it doesn't comply with the building regulations. D is pegged at the building regulation requirements, the maximum requirements. So, but from an energy point of view or the energy industry point of view, no, you can't be penalized. I think it's just will be a visualization. It will be a dashboard where people can see, but look, my building something needs to be done. And that's where the ESCO market will make sort of inroads, because they'll be able to identify the opportunity. The building owner will be able to say, I need help, come and find out where this energy is being wasted. But from an energy point of view, no penalties. The penalty right now, the only penalty that exists is non-compliance with obtaining an EPC by the 7th of December next year. And that penalty is 5 million rand or 5 years in jail or both. But otherwise, no, you won't be penalized.
Thank you for that, Bay. And then allow me to close the webinar off by, first of all, thanking the presenters. Jerry, Markie, and in his absence, Frank, thank you very much for your participation. With your knowledge and background, we can almost not do without. It's most important that we need to get an agreement as to what the interpretation should be of certain things and how we can go about doing our jobs. Thank you for that. I really appreciate it. And especially you, Jerry, we've been pushing your button quite often to assist us in this field, and you always welcome us to contact you. So we appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
With that, then, I would like to close this meeting and thank Matlacho and Tira for their work done. I see Frank has not left still. Thank you very much for your work done. And hopefully we'll see each other in the follow-ups webinars in this series. Thank you very much.
With an EPC in your hand for the building you're currently occupying.
Tell them, Barry.